Okay, well this is the second of our recordings for NPower. And so remember the first part, what we were doing is we were taking information from the idle processes and using them as an idle user. So we went into ServiceNow and we performed things like opened an incident, opened a problem, and looked for knowledge. So we used some of those idle processes in ServiceNow. But now, as I said before in the email, now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to do this from the perspective of an administrator. So I'm going to talk, and I know this is a bit of a shift, I'm not going to be doing anything with incident or anything with problem. We're going to be talking about some of the things that you do to administrate ServiceNow so that you can set it up for people who are using, will be doing all the stuff that we had shown in the previous video. So these are some of the tasks in your book, and it's very important to remember that for these tasks you will be logging into your own instance. So what I mean by that is, I'll come over here on a tab. Each of you has your own instance with a number. And so where mine says NPower Instructor, it's really yours might be something like Samar NPower 008. And when you would log into that system, you might have to click Proceed because there's a security, these things are set up as HTTPS, and that's fine. But when you log in, you'll notice your name will be in there. And so that system, you're not going to log in with your name. With that system, you're going to follow the login that's right down here. You're going to log in as admin, and the password for that will be NPower. Now, there is a lab in your book. It starts on page 44. Lab 1.1 and Lab 1.2 on pages 8 and 18 are strictly navigation. So I believe that you can do that lab completely on your own. And since you can, then really all I want to do is walk through one of the labs that's a little bit more complicated over the next 10-15 minutes. And I'll record that so you can go back and review your work as you go through. This lab is more administrative for how you set up ServiceNow, and we'll be setting up several pieces just to get a feel for the different tools and aspects of ServiceNow. Each of these things can be looked over in the wiki. So if you were looking in the book on page, I believe it starts on page, probably page 51 or 52, I think. Oh, I'm sorry, page 63. So if you're in your book on page 63, one of the things that you'll notice is you're going to be doing several pieces. Right up at that lab topics area, you're going to see UI policies, UI actions, data policies, and UI actions, a business rule, and a client script. Those are all components under ServiceNow that do things, and the point to this lab is to familiarize yourself with them. Now, any one of those topics you can get more information from on the wiki. So, if I were to type wiki.servicenow, and maybe I wanted to know more about how business rules work. If I type in the wiki business rules, oops, I should have typed business. And you'll notice there's a whole wiki article that kind of will follow right in path with the stuff that we're doing. So you don't have to do this in class. You can follow up with this at any point. But I'd like for everybody to do that. It's an important element to really understanding what's going on in the system. Now, let's take a look at this lab, and I'm going to walk through it. The first thing that they want us to point out in the lab, and so I'll look in my version, so instead of doing the work that's in there for Eve, I'm going to do this in my system. But you, of course, Eve will do the work in Eve's system, Shravan will do the work in Shravan's system, etc. But if I were in that system, then the first thing that I'd want to do is, it says you already know how to personalize a form to add fields. And we did talk about that in previous episodes, right? We right-click and personalize. So we want to verify that the subcategory displays under category on the incident form. The quickest way to do that is to type incident. And so I were to go to incident and create new. I have my incident form open, and then I can see category and subcategory. Now if it wasn't there, we remember that we could personalize by right-click, personalize, and form layout. And then I would just look for the subcategory field and bring it in. But we assume that that's already there. So what we're going to do is, the next step, it says create a UI policy. So we're going to create a record in a table called the UI policy table. And that will actually remove the subcategory when the category is inquiry help. So the way that we do that is that same method. We would right-click the header. Now remember, this is something we can only do as the administrator. And then we would personalize UI policies. Now, I want you to know that when I do that, I'm really going into a table. Remember early on I said everything's a record in a table. You can always tell the table name by looking in the upper left corner. If I, as an administrator, I came over here and looked at UI policy, you'd see there's a whole table for UI policies. This is just the ones that are the UI policies for incident. And so at that point, I can do step 2, which is to click New. And when I do that, I'll be prompted with a UI policy form. And to do those pieces, I want to change the order to 500. And I would put, in this case, it's lab 1.3, and the description is hide subcategory. Right? And then I would say that they have that condition when category. So I can choose that. When category is inquiry help. And then it tells me instead of submitting, because that would take me back to the list, I right-click and save. And then at that point, I want to choose under the related links. I come down here where it says UI policy actions and I click New. And I want to look for the fields. There's 2 fields. Actually just one, right? Subcategory. So I come down here and I find subcategory. There it is. And if subcategory, I want to say it's false that it's visible, and it's false that it's mandatory, and false that it's visible. Now on page 65, they tell me I can submit this. And really what I'm saying here, and I'm not going to do the next steps because the next steps would test this. But really what I'm saying here is when I have an incident and the category is inquiry help, this field will be not mandatory and not visible. Now since this reverse if false thing is checked, what that means is if it's any category that is not inquiry help, then it is true that it's mandatory and it's true that it's visible. So that's one of the labs that we do. The next element that we do in ServiceNow is a data policy, and the difference being that a data policy does things at a deeper level. Data policy affects everything, really. It means that if I were to import stuff, then the data policy would still apply. So at this point, I go to Problem and Create New. And what we want to kind of demonstrate, the reason we're building a data policy is right now, if I were to move the state to closed and submit, the system would let me do that. And I don't really want to do that. So, and again, to change that, I could go to right-click, personalize, data policy. But we really want you to understand that this data policy, it's actually a table. So the directions tell us on step 6 on page 65 to go to System Policy, Rules, and Data Policies. Now I could search through all of these to find system, and there's system, and system policy would be farther down, and I'd expand that, and under that there's a section called rules, and then there's data policy. But I could also just use the navigator, and in the navigator I could type data policy, and there it is. So the point to that is it makes it come up more quick. Now this was a record that I wasn't doing anything with, so it's okay to leave it. And I'm going to build a new data policy. Now this data policy is for the table problem. Oh, wrong one. And I want to make sure that I don't want it to reverse if false. I do want it to run. This will apply for even integrations like SOAP integrations and imports. So that's handy and helpful to know. And I want to be able to say that the state I believe we wanted to say the state is closed or resolved. And then again, I want to save this. And I'm saving this so that I can get to the data policy rules. These are the fields that will be affected by this policy. And once again, I'm going to click New. Pardon me, I have my screen set up a little awkwardly. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the Close Notes field. That's this field right here, is true that it's mandatory. Now this means if I were to do an integration, even if that integration was something, even if that integration was from some external source, right, imported a bunch of problem tickets, if the state from the imported problem ticket was closed resolved, and I didn't have the, if the state was closed resolved and I didn't have that information completed, then it wouldn't, then the record would bounce. It would come back, it wouldn't actually be entered in service now because that field is mandatory. Closed notes is mandatory. So there's a test for that too on page 67, and I'm not going to test that. You can see how that works itself, but I wanted you to see how we did this. So I'll click Update. Now the next thing we're going to do in that lab, looking on page 67, that's a UI action. And so if I look on page 67 with a UI action, then in that piece, UI actions are the things that make buttons appear. So in UI actions, if I went to UI action, I don't need to type system definition. I can just type UI actions, and I'll click on that. UI actions are another table. They're the table of the things that make buttons work. So if I add new, I would add a new button. In my case, if I look at step 2, what they're telling me on page 67 is in the UI actions table, I want to search for the save button. Now this is very important. Step 2 on page 67 says type *save in the go to name search field. Now right now it says go to order. So, and yours will say something, it may say the same or it may say different. It depends on what you last searched. So you need to make sure that the go to is name. So really what I'm doing is I'm looking at the name field where the name is save. And when I do that search, the system will come up with all of the save buttons. Now, what they tell me to do from there is they point out in a search, if you right-click any field, I can say Show Matching. So this will show me only the saves that are global. So it helps me filter an already filtered list. And if you notice, what's happening here is I'm changing that breadcrumb as it filters through the table more and more. And then I want to expand that breadcrumb, that's step 5 on page 68. And then to this list where I'm saying I want the name to have save and I want it to be only on the global table. And I want the comments field to contain the word context. And now I only have 2 to worry about. And if I look at each of these, the thing that they want me to do on step 8 and 9 really is simply to select this save button and check form button. And the reason we're doing this is right now, if I hit save, I have to right click the header to see the save button. But when I click this little checkbox by form, what that's going to do is that's going to turn this instead of a context menu, which is what we get with a right click or a hold down, and it'll instead make it a button. So anything that you see that's a UI action, if you want it to be a button, you can simply check form button and that will make it visible. Now we could get further about this and talk about the JavaScript that makes the button run, but as an administrator, a lot of what you'll be doing at first is just managing the buttons. So if I do that, what I'm doing is I'm saying I want that universal save button thing, that universal save action to become a button everywhere. And when I do that, take a look at what happens. So even in UI actions, I now have a save button. And that's why we did that, and that kind of comes in handy. Now, the next thing we do on page 69 is a business rule. And really what we want to do for that is, there is a table for that, of course, right? Because everything's a record in a table. I could